Taking the stance of being a peer or an equal implies that each of us brings something necessary to the table, and this is the basis of respect. That's perhaps one of the most important features of dialogue. It humanizes organizations that have been depersonalized in a moral and ethical way. This interest to understand another person's actual experience without explicitly or implicitly condoning their behavior is the humanizing factor needed to help spring the trap of fragmentation.
Hello, and welcome to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast. I'm June Boyle, co-founder of Dialogue Associates, along with Peter Garrett. In this podcast, we aim to bring the concept of dialogue into your life and the way you work. And we're doing this by exploring the chapters of Peter's book, A New Kind of Dialogue. Although we're just a few chapters away from the end of the book, the story continues. Please let us know what you've learned and what you're taking forward, and also what you'd like to hear us do next on the podcast. In today's episode, we explain the evolution of dialogue, moving from an intervention method for individual teams to an approach that encompasses the dynamics of whole systems, effectively levelling up the impact of dialogue in the organisational world. We'll touch on the differences between open and closed organisational systems and how dialogue is used in both settings, as well as how dialogue can be used as a research methodology. Before we do that, a heads up, we've got another amazing guest joining us at the end of the show, so stay tuned for that. June Boyle is an expert in HR and organisational effectiveness, with experience at senior executive level in many global organisations such as BP, Royal Bank of Scotland, BT, and is currently chair of the board at Napier University. She'll be reflecting on these chapters and posing a question to Peter. So Peter, let's get started. We're going to open today's episode with chapter 19 of the book, which is titled Dialogue as a Systemic Architecture in Closed Systems. Could you say a little bit for our listeners about what a closed system is? What does that mean?
Earlier in the book, I talk about yet another reorganization, which refers definitely to closed systems. In a closed system, the accountability rises level by level, eventually to one person. Very occasionally you have joint CEOs or two people working together in charge, but generally speaking it's one person. And it's not so much that it's one registered organization. You can have a multinational with 20 or 30 different organizations, but they all in the end come back to one person. That's a closed system, and you can do things are different in a closed system from an open system.
The other bit of context that I think will be helpful at this point is to say something about this journey that we've been picking up through the podcast, from running discrete dialogue groups to intervention work and now into this whole system work. Could you just say a little bit about that movement, I guess?
Yeah, so that's, you may recall early on I talked about one or two dialogue groups we began in prisons. One of them I mentioned, a man called Steve Holland, came into the group and joined in, sat down, listened. He was one of the more senior people in the prison. And he was just amazed at the end. He said to me, this is like, wow, I could do my work quite differently. So that was Steve encountering a dialogue group. Later, he commissioned me and on opening a new part of a prison, which was it was an opportunity to create a different culture. And then later, both of us, if you remember, we talked about the situation on what was called F-Wing, where there was effectively had become a segregation unit and had a lot of trouble. And that was intervention work. Basically, Steve said, I have a problem. All the things we do won't address this problem, but I think you could probably help me. And of course I can. So in we went, that's intervention work. This is a problem. One was a problem, one was an opportunity. Later, and you know because you were part of them, he was further down in his career. So he was in charge of a prison and later moved to other prisons. And we had echoes of that. One of them opening a new wing, which we'd had with Steve. He was then placed in charge of opening a new prison. So that's a different question. An accommodation unit or a wing in a prison might involve 50 or 100 people. When you talk about a new prison, when we opened with him, you're talking about a few thousand people. You're talking about people incarcerated, a lot of staff, how do they all work together? And particularly in that case where you have a new building, new staff, inexperienced people. So bringing dialogue into that requires an architecture. You need an architecture to put up a series of buildings. Like, what's the overall design? What are we trying to reach, and how are we going to get there step by step? That's what I think of as architecture. And of course, we had the same echo of F-Wing, where there were all the problems when we went and worked in Birmingham prison, which was in such difficulty. Yeah.
So Steve Holland's one of the leaders that you talk about in your book, and you describe the work you did together. You also described, actually last episode, I think we talked about work in Trinidad, and you worked with the leader there. And you described two other examples in this chapter. Before I ask you to say more about those pieces of work, can you just say about the relationship that you establish with these leaders? What's the quality that you're looking for in that relationship?
I have tried to work with leaders who are not that serious about their work for a number of reasons. Maybe they're close to retirement, or maybe they're not in the job they should be in, or whatever. And it's very difficult to do significant work with somebody who's not trying to bring about change. So I've looked for people who have some energy to improve things, but also have integrity. It's hard to work with people who are not honest. And I've been lucky. I found a number of really high integrity individuals who want to do something. And a large amount of my work has been driven by a few of these individuals. So I've tried to enter into partnership with them. So not that they're running the show and I work for them, not that I'm telling them what to do, but that together we're looking at what they're doing, and I have a contribution to make, and they, of course, have a leadership role to play. And I call that two in agreement. It's, I don't know, if you close one eye, you don't have perspective. You've got vision with one eye, but when you have two eyes, you've got depth. And two of you together can start to triangulate, if you like that word. You and I have different perspectives, and together we're looking at the same thing. We get a whole much richer understanding of it that way. And that's what I've tried to do, is to work together thinking about the situation that we're trying to manage. So I've loved work where I have one leader who wants to change and wants to learn and is committed to doing it, who has a team that we both work with together in the room and develop, and a particular piece of work they're really trying to do, and to follow that. That's been my ideal.
Could you say there's a very big story to be told, which I want to pick up on, where Harold Clarke is the leader of the organisation that you partner with. Mm-hmm. But before that, just tell me a little bit about, because it's a commercial story you tell about working with a guy called Tufan Erginbilgic, if I pronounced that correctly. You were partnering with him and, as an architect, creating the structure for something to change in his organisation. Could you say a little bit about that? What did you do there? It's a commercial setting, so I think it's a bit different.
So Tufan, a Turkish man. I don't recall ever hearing him say something that wasn't true. He didn't lie, he didn't tell fibs. He was, or is, a very straight man. A very high regard for him. I was doing some work, oil and gas, multinational. To give you a feel of the pace of work, I was interviewing people between Christmas and New Year. don't know what you do between Christmas and New Year, but what I did was drove down to the headquarters and interviewed a number of people in order to work with their team. One of the people I interviewed was Tufan. I enjoyed meeting him, interviewing him. The interview was maybe 40 minutes. At the end he said, "Would you coach me?" I said, "Yes." And that was the beginning of something really special. Now, despite the huge size of organizations, not many people know how to make money. Everybody does. They don't. Everybody knows how to work within an organization that's geared to do that. But there are a few individuals in large organizations who know how to make money, and Tufan was one of them. So I had the privilege, in a way, of working with him to begin a new organization and to gather the people who would be involved in that, to sit down with that newly formed team and work out its vision, its purpose, how it would want to operate. It was a distribution situation where countries across Europe who worked individually and in other remits joined together so they were all operating. We brought them together. And there were just a whole series of things that were different. One thing with him was we met every month for 3 days. He abandoned head office, no head office building, just each month in a different one of the countries, in the business, all the leaders, all 11 leaders together, and not, these are your marching orders, these are the decisions I think we need to make. Over the next 3 days, these are the things I think we have to settle on. What do you think? Agree, then together think them through and make the decision, and then leave. Very few decisions remade, because everybody's there. Normally you make the decision, well, of course, if I'd known that, we obviously have to adapt it. Not that. No, people had to be there for the 3 days. It actually took them 5 days because they arrived on a Monday and left on a Friday, and the meeting might have been in Istanbul, or it might have been in Paris, or it might have been in Lisbon, depended which country was involved. The other thing I should say is, having got the businesses moving, his aim was to increase the volume of business and profitability and reduce costs at the same time. It's like, we're going to do both. When we got the thing ticking over, and still after some time taking 1 week out of every month together as a leadership team, then said, okay, we can predict that something unpredictable will happen next year. It's absolutely predictable. We don't know what it'll be, but every year something comes up that is a major crisis. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a few days and name what are 10 things that would really be serious if they happened, about labour, about competitors, about this and that. We chose 7 of the big ones, said, okay, what are we going to do? Let's assume Russia has started retailing in competition to us here in Europe. What are we going to do? Sat down and worked out contingency plans. Some of them were quite mechanical. They would say, well, what levers will we pull? Others were not that, but it was here, if that arose, this is what we'd do. It's a kind of scenario thinking, if you like. What happened the following year? Something that nobody could predict. Bang. What do we do? Pull the levers, make the changes. Not like the next day, the next week, right? And meanwhile, our competitors were all having emergency meetings and saying, my God, what's going to happen here? It was just remarkable, the anticipation of how to run a business commercially well. And it was entirely dialogic, by which I mean it was entirely transparent. It wasn't hidden, it was open, what we're thinking about, why, and how to do it together. Transparent, open decision-making like that in an organization is unusual. It's not common at all, and very, very successful. Had such fun too.
I can tell. So, Harold Clarke, we heard from him in episode 5, but you had a long relationship with him. And in the book particularly describe the experience in Virginia Department of Corrections, which is the job he's recently retired from. Could you tell us what Harold was trying to do when he arrived in Virginia?
Harold is from Panama. He'd come into corrections and been in corrections for a long time and held senior roles in several states. And Virginia was a very large state. And he came with the idea that prisons should be a healing environment. A more basic idea is we should reduce recidivism, stop people going back to prison. His idea was, no, we should have what we'll call lasting public safety, that the environment itself should lead to people finding a different understanding of their life and what they intended to do. And I could leap to the end and say he's very successful over the period of time that we worked with him. It was doing well before he arrived, but it's been in the top first or second lowest recidivism rate in any state in the US now. And I've no doubt that the dialogue work has made a contribution to that, and I think he would say the same thing.
So what was the situation in the organisation when we arrived? Could you say a little bit about that? And therefore, what were the first steps?
It was a command and control culture. Because Harold Clarke was the director, what he said happened. And we were commissioned to go and work there 4 weeks in a year and had a very open brief, which was wonderful. First meeting, said, okay, on the third day, I would like to have all the executive leaders, which would be the top 100 people from prisons and above, like a warden of a prison, and there are perhaps 30 to 40 prisons there, chief of probation. So I said, okay, we'll have a meeting. There'll be about 120 people. Interviewed a couple of people. I said to one of them, how many of them do you think will be there? It's quite a lot, 120. He said, if the director says they'll be there, they'll be there. There they all were, everyone. So this was strong command and control, and in such a situation, inevitably fear. There was a background fear and a lot of stories in the background about lack of safety at a serious level. Some black employees I worked with would be very reluctant to go to the west of the state, which still had quite a strong echoes of Civil War memory and so on. So this was not a healing environment. And his proposal that it should be, I think, was not received with wide acclaim. I think the general feeling was, well, we'll be here when he's gone. Let's wait and see.
And so having got that group of 120 people together, what was the first dialogic piece of work with them?
So the architecture was to do a top-down piece of work, and first met with the director and his deputies and assumed that stance of what I'd call partnership. This is your business, you're running it, not me. This is what I have to bring. What do you hope in this first week we'll achieve? Like when we sit down at the end of the week on Friday, what do you want to say has changed? Because that's what we're going to make happen. It's very interesting. They were quite, we don't normally achieve what we think like that. Then with the senior leadership team, and then with the larger executive group, and with each of them thinking how we're going to manage the next group, and then back again. So that was the beginning of that work. We realized that that group of 120 would have to work with quite a way. They were not in leadership shape, although they were running the whole department well. We began by looking at the flow of communication. We took the most senior man, Harold Clarke, the director, at one end. We said, right, who reports to you? And we took one representative, a deputy. Who reports to you? We took one person, a regional guy. Who reports to you? The deputy regional. Who reports to you? Till we got down to the warden. Then within the warden, they have military ranks, the major, and then a captain, and then a sergeant, and a lieutenant, and then a correctional officer, then a prisoner. So with this line up in the middle of the room, people could see their line of command, their hierarchy. And of course, the vast numbers are at the bottom, where the correctional officers and the prisoners or inmates are. Then we looked at how does a message move from the top down? How does a message move from the bottom up? And you could add to that.
Well, I remember somebody say messages get filtered on the way down and they get buffed on the way up.
On the way down, people know what we're doing, why, how, what the alternatives are, what's needed, when. The bottom, to do this. Why? So I'm telling you. On the way up, we can't manage, well, we're under pressure. Well, they're battling, but they're doing it. Well, our people are really what we depend on. And as a director, I want to say how the people are the most important thing here. Now, when we looked at that, we said, don't send your leaders off to some expensive leadership course. You've got to work out how you're going to get communication from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top that's meaningful and honest and straightforward. And you can't walk from the top, bypass and go and ask them at the bottom. They're not going to tell you in the right way and you're going to miss out a lot of people. So this very practical thing, I think they got from the beginning, we don't understand everybody's situation. This is not open, commonly understood. We don't have a common understanding of the situation.
So there are some elements to the work in Virginia. I'm going to just ask you about some of them in sequence. One was then the skills. We talked last episode about dialogue skills in different ways. We introduced skills to Virginia. Why were they important?
The way any system is operating, including this one, is there for a good reason. People behave the way they do and relate to each other because that's the easiest and most obvious way to do it. That's how we do it around here. Try it differently, you'll soon find out why you don't do it. That's how we do it. They say that, but this is what we do, kind of thing. So it's like that. When you introduce a new approach, and you can do it quite successfully when you're present and helping it along, when you leave, it regresses back to what it was. Why? Because that's the easiest way to do it. So you have to establish more than that, and so skills and named skills start to hold it more clearly. So a simple thing like listening, if you say that one of the key things to listen with respect, when you, I didn't actually listen to what she was saying, let's listen and so on. So introducing skills is the way to start to ratchet the change so it doesn't drop back all the time.
And opposing, can you say a little bit about opposing as one of the skills?
Yes.
And why that was important?
In a command and control situation, I say do this, and the answer is yes, sir. No matter what you're thinking or feeling, yes, sir. If I say do this and you say no, you're not going to last in your job very long, I can assure you. So we had to change that pattern in the culture where saying no may be very helpful. It's not saying, no, I won't follow your instruction or your order. It's, can I bring in some other information here that might make a difference? So before I act on that, so we had to find a way of opposing, disagreeing could be done in a respectful way and bring in information that otherwise was missing, which we knew from the way in which information flows. There was a lot of information that wasn't getting through. Decisions were being made that were not helpful because information wasn't there. So that was a big piece. It took a lot of work. The interesting thing for me and for you was this is a staff of over 11,000 people. We couldn't be in the room with all of them one by one, so we had to develop practitioners to do that work. And we wouldn't be there when they did it. So that's a little difficult. Like, how are they going to do that? And they, in turn, had to develop other practitioners. So people learned from people we'd never met. So we really had to start to, what I'd call, codify the thing. We're doing this intuitively. We had to get far more specific about what matters and what doesn't, because other people need to do this without our involvement. So that was a great learning for us. How do you extend this work through a whole system? And what's the architecture that can achieve that? Yeah.
And many years later, it's now 10 years since that Dialogue Practitioner Development Programme was established. 10 years later, it's still going in the department, and I think they have around 250 dialogue practitioners.
They do, who are in all ranks and all departments and work part of their role on developing dialogue work and supporting dialogue work. So that was skill development. It also, of course, we had to get to decision making. So we had to get to how to coach people. We found people didn't have conversations. Just in the end, they said no, and they disciplined somebody. There was nothing between the rule book and disciplining quite often. We had to bring out no. First, you need to dialogue. You need to talk together, think together about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Then if people don't know, you need to coach them. They may not know or understand. Then you need to hold them to account. You can't hold somebody to account who doesn't know how to do something or doesn't know what's needed, and the disciplining at the end. And we tried to move a lot of it to a verbal process rather than a written process, which is required once you get to disciplining people. It's far more economic to have a conversation than to write a whole lot of reports in a disciplinary process. So, and far more successful in retaining your staff.
Now, even though this was a closed system where everybody reported to Harold Clarke ultimately, there were two things that I think we introduced that were a way in which everyone could see the role that they played in the organisation and what the organisation was trying to do. Could you say a little bit about the Serving the Commonwealth of Virginia graphic that people will find in the book?
Yes.
And the role it played.
So the hierarchical fragmentation we looked at with the chain of command and communication. The other thing in the organisation is people have different roles. So some people are involved with security, making sure that people are held in prison, don't escape, but also are held safely and securely and in a good way. The others are involved with treatment. If you want a healing environment, what do you offer that enables people to change? Other people are involved with administrative functions, when are people released or whatever. Others involved with finance, others involved with transport, others involved with courts, others involved in the community. The fragmentation there is that all these people are working in a different department. You ask somebody in finance, what's this department like? It's very different from asking somebody in security what it's like, or somebody in transport what it's like. So we had to find a way of how do we all have a common understanding of what we're doing. And this graphic we produced and worked in depth with people, one part was fiscal. That department had a budget of around $1 billion given to it by the state of Virginia, the government, to expend in a responsible way. They had to get their head around the fact we spend $1 billion of the state's money for a particular purpose, which is to provide public safety. Second one is we have people incarcerated, we have people in prison. They have to be treated soundly and well. We raised the question, which was true for some of them, if you had a relative, a son, a husband, a daughter in prison, would you be comfortable with the way they're now held? This is a real question, because it has to work for lasting public safety. So there's a moral, ethical thing about it all. What we found that's common in any organisation is there are lots of initiatives trying to improve the situation. And we gathered all those initiatives into a common purpose, which was the overall improvement of how this is run. That enabled people to see how each of them made a difference to the whole process. How I drew up my budget made a difference to how security functioned and so on. So it became a more transparent, common understanding in the process.
And then the final piece that I want to talk about, there's a lot in this story, and I would recommend people go to the book to hear more about all of these elements. There's a piece on the offender resettlement journey, which was another integrating activity, I guess, that we brought in.
I might mention one other piece first. As a closed system. In a closed system, they had to deal with the different departments and different groupings and divisions in decision-making quite often. So run up into a decision that affected not only security but also treatment and the kitchens or transport. So we created what we called a working dialogue, which was a dialogic process for multi-stakeholder groups to make a decision. And that had become a business practice. But that's another way to anchor the process of fragmentation into clear decision-making. The offender resettlement journey you mentioned is really more open system related. So in an open system, you can track the journey of a citizen to offending, to being arrested, to being held in a jail perhaps, and then taken to court, and then being sentenced, going through the sentence, being released, coming back under supervision and trying to find their way back into normal life as a contributing citizen. The reason for that, looking at that journey, and well, it's quite good to go into open systems in a way, is that open systems don't report to one person. So in that system, the police report to one person, the jail reports to another, who holds the person until they go to court. When they go to court, the judge reports to yet another system and another individual. And if they're sentenced to prison, they're in yet another system, in this case, reporting through to Harold Clarke. When they come out, they're supported by all sorts of agencies. So the big question in open system architecture is we can't start with the director and work down, because there may be half a dozen directors. So what can you use? You have to find the common thread that matters to everyone. The journey of the offender is common to all those agencies that I mentioned. Having to arrest them, having to try them, having to hold them, having to treat them, and so on, is common. If you can find the thread, then you can take a fragmented system where people are not aware of what each other are doing, or duplicating services, or have gaps. You can get them all together around a table to start to look at the common need, the common purpose. So in this case, it's the journey of the offender, and eventually that is measured by what is called recidivism. So how often people return to prison, that's the measure that is used in this industry. And the offender resettlement journey is a way of tracking that. We, of course, like to do that live and in a real way. So we get all the different agencies in the room displayed like the system, with a prison gate and so on, where the court is, where the individuals are. And then we invited individuals who were in prison or had been in prison to come and walk their journey. It's a very powerful emotional experience to hear somebody who's spent 15 years of their life in prison talking about that journey and what it was like being sentenced, what it was like their first day in prison, how the tactics they used to try and deal with it, how things that didn't matter to staff affected them very, very deeply, and so on, how other things that other members of staff did they didn't know just really helped them hugely. So a very salutary process for everyone to see. This really does, how I behave makes a difference to how everything works. It brings it right back to the individual. And those offender resettlement journeys, I think, are the way to deal with the whole criminal justice system effectively.
Yeah.
They're a key.
Yeah. So we've used the Virginia story and experience to move into the next chapter, which was chapter 20, which is on just this dialogue as a systemic architecture
You
in
notice,
open systems.
You notice they're all interrelated.
They are, absolutely. Yeah, that's another question for later, is what makes a kind of integrated model. But here, that was one example. Another where you started with closed system work and went into an open system was in Trinidad. Last episode, I think we heard about the work in Trinidad with BG for a guy called Derek Hudson. But you went beyond the walls of their organisation there in a different way, because it wasn't connected to their organisation so directly. Would you like to say a little bit about that and what was different about that open system work?
This stretches over into a further chapter on research, so dialogue and research. But in this case, I travelled regularly to Trinidad for a week or two at a time, perhaps 4 or 5 times a year for maybe 4 years. So I was coming and going quite regularly to Trinidad. I worked with several organisations there, not only BG. But as I was travelling, you can't help but read in the papers the level of crime and violence, very, very high. A higher rate of homicide, or what we call murder, than in Jamaica, which is always known to be extremely high. So, of course, I talked with drivers, I talked with the barman, I talked with the person who gave me a cup of coffee to start to find out about it. And I got really quite intrigued by the peculiar nature of the problem in Trinidad, which was partly related to gangs, partly related to drugs, partly related to the way the government responded, partly related to the way in which society works there. So as I got more interested, I just started to research the thing, and I started to form a theory about how they'd ended up in the situation they had. Part of it related to gangs. Gangs have been common in the country, and I happened to, in my inquiries, find a Catholic priest who's now Archbishop, I think, risen to high levels, and a colleague, and through them started to meet some of the gang leaders. And it was quite surprising to find quite young men who had murdered quite a few people and start to find out how gangs work. They don't work very well economically, apart from the people at the top. People at the top do great. People lower down are having to sell drugs and so on. But what I discovered was not only that this was about the lack of men staying with their wives and children, but also the women needing to go to the US to work and the grandmothers looking after children. As the gangs got strong, the gang leader, which was a little closed system, had the guns. And as drugs came through, it got a bit messier. So the government stepped in, arrested the key gang leaders, 4 or 5 of them, and executed them. I think they were actually hung, but they were no longer alive at the end of their sentence. And assuming this would be helpful, what happened is each of the gangs they had run splintered into a number of gangs with younger leaders, and gradually it got younger and younger. So half the deaths in the country were gang-related, and those gang-related deaths were being committed by teenagers who didn't expect to have a very long life and were right not to expect it from their experience. I managed to get the commercial organizations to commit to help their environment. So they lived in an environment that affected their staff, so we said, let's help. So I then proposed, and they agreed, that I interview the people involved. So I interviewed the police about their experience, I interviewed the Minister of Justice, interviewed the Minister in charge of prisons, and went to a maximum security prison, had the chance to address 120 life sentence prisoners, which is quite an eye-opener, and hear what they're doing about it and so on. But I also talked with probation, talked with the churches, talked with all sorts of people, got them together and found the tough area was in Port of Spain, which is the capital. And there's one area called Morvant-Leventil, and they developed a project there called the Morvant-Leventil Initiative, MLI, The government, the minister sponsored the thing. We went along and had a formal opening. And the idea was to create a community centre that would enable the community to function. Very difficult to do in that culture. The gangs put people into the work teams who are necessary to do the works and build a community centre. And they could block roads and stop police going down them and so on. So this is tough stuff.
Yeah, tough stuff. Sounds like some of the tough situations you described in maximum security prisons, but out in the community where you don't have the walls and the guards and the security that supports you. Yeah. What was the dialogic intervention or dialogic system work that you brought into that kind of dangerous and chaotic situation?
Well, and I have to say, I was unable to commit the time to see full success on that, so I can't claim that. The big thing was to deal with the fragmentation in all the government agencies. So using the power of the commercial organisations, 3 businesses contributed to just over half the total income for the government. So knowing the CEO of one of those businesses meant I could use his influence to draw together the different ministries and look at how to tackle this. So part of it was that. Part of it was that for a community to work, it has to have a heart that's safe enough for people to be together and to learn with each other. And there was some, and enjoy each other's presence. And there was such fear there. I mean, kids there who could tell you what gun that was that just fired. They knew a different gun. Oh, that was a so-and-so. Young kids were having to move drugs on behalf of their parents and so on. This is, and also just to drain the overflow of swamping required dealing with 4 different ministries, all of whom had different bureaucracies. So it was very much dealing with fragmentation at government level, but then also starting to see how to gather individuals to start to deal with this. So I had a gathering of all the individuals who worked with gangs, got together about 30 of them to hear how they approached working with gangs and what to do. One probation officer telling me, talking with a young man who's under supervision with me, and his father comes along with him, wants to be involved and sits down and puts his gun on the table when we start talking. Mm. So how does a young woman who's a probation officer manage that? This is not uncommon in many parts of the world, you know. We live in a very fortunate situation that we have civil government that works. Yeah. So that's something I would have loved to have put more time and energy to, but I couldn't fly every week to Trinidad to try to transfer what I needed to that situation.
In these stories, how you convene the group when it's an open system is important. Sounds like for Virginia and the offender resettlement journey, the authority of Harold Clarke in his agency drew people from their other agencies and their partners. Here in Trinidad, you had the power and authority of the commercial organisation that drew people in as well. There's several more stories in the chapter, but one you describe is the work we did around migration. What was the draw then that brought people together?
Well, if we talk about the skill, the dialogic skill is to see a system and recognise that thought is held collectively in different groupings, different subcultural groupings, divisions, departments, whatever it might be, organisations, hold a different perspective. So the skill is to say, what are the groupings that would need to be in one conversation openly to shift this problem? Now, it's a skill seeing it. The next skill is depicting it as a graphic. How do you draw this situation, this problem we have, this fragmented situation, in a way that everybody's on the page? When you can do that, and people can recognize it, say, yeah, that's where we are, and recognize the other players, then you can start to bring that into form in the room. If it's small enough, you could get the whole group depicted in the room. If it's larger, you have to get representation of those groups. But that's the process. The other is, as we talked about before with the offender resettlement journey, is what is the common thread if it's an open system? Well, the migration work was an open system, and we were lucky we were employed in that case by the German government to contribute to what they were trying to do. And they had got the idea, which was the thread, which is the migration should be of benefit to all. A fragmented version is migration should be of benefit to those who are under pressure and have to migrate, or it should be a benefit to the countries who leave, who get money, come back, or to the countries where people arrive and open restaurants and add diversity.
Work for cheap, yeah.
Work cheap labour. But how could migration be a benefit to all, to everyone? Now, that's the real question. Who needs to be at the table for that is the real question. So this was very interesting work in the migration lab. The echo, of course, was the United Nations, and the United Nations had guidance not for migration but for refugees
and asylum seekers. Yes.
And so they had a code for refugees but not for migration. Numbers of refugees are quite small. Migration is, about 15-20% of the world's population in migration. There's huge numbers of migration. Just in China, the number of people migrating is phenomenal. So migration is a big issue. So what we did was, although we had a small migration lab, in other words, lab meaning laboratory, a series of meetings to start to see how we could combine people who were in government contributing to the flow of migration, people in business, commercial people, and people in NGOs or trying on the ground to help the process. We had the three groupings together. And we echoed what we were doing. We could see how we related to what the United Nations was trying to do. So if you see the graphic on that, you'll see how we associated ourselves with that to give the weight of commitment and seriousness to people. They were used to going into meetings and giving their opinions, having fun, but one day, no, this is actually a contribution to what will affect United Nations policy in time. And it did. We had a link up with the UN team while they were working on it, if you recall, at the same time.
Now, the final chapter we're going to look at in this episode, and we don't have so much time to do that, is on dialogue as a research methodology. Luckily, you've already talked about some of the situations where you've used research in the dialogue work, but you came across more traditional social research in your early days in prisons, and worked alongside criminologists particularly. How would you describe what the differences are between the kind of more conventional social research they might have been doing and the research that dialogue enables?
If I take a specific example, working in Whitemore Prison early on, the Cambridge Institute of Criminology came and did research work there. So I got to know Alison Liebling, who was the professor who came and worked. My view, not particularly of Alison, but generally, is that as a researcher, you come from the outside, you inquire, you go away, you write a report or a book, you submit it. You can't talk about the worst bits or you won't keep getting work. So the bits you have to politically keep quiet, otherwise another prison won't say, come along and do this. But also, it's your name on your report, and then people choose to adopt it or not, or whatever. The dialogic approach to research work is that you have the organisation talking with itself. You can't start immediately. You have to find out the relevant groupings, get them in confident enough to talk openly, but in a sequence of steps, you start to get the organisation openly saying what its situation is in different parts of that same organisation. And as you do that, it starts to become evident that there's some things that could be done that will make all the difference. And by the end of the intervention come research work, everybody's agreed these are some things we should be moving on if we're able to find the time or money or whatever to do it. So it's not the kind of research that's then introduced from management and try and get buy-in from people. Everybody knows it. So you have to base it on what everybody's already talking about, but not talking to other people about. You have to get what's being talked about. You might remember right back with David Byrne, what's talked about in the coffee break into the dialogue, get what's talked about privately in that part out into the open in a way that can be heard. And it becomes, any system can sort itself out if you can do that. So if you do good dialogic research, when you leave, you're able, with people in the organisation, to name these are steps which people believe would make a difference, and this is what people would like to move on, and leave it with everyone to either find the resource or time or find an alternative or not move on it.
So research that leads to action. Yeah.
So one piece of research, for example, situation in a US juvenile prison where juveniles were sexually abusing staff, and at senior levels it was believed that it was hardly happening. At middle senior levels it's definitely not happening because people get fired if they didn't report it. At lower levels it was prevalent. At the lowest levels it was, if I wrote every report, I wouldn't be able to do my job. And again, we went right down and talked with the offenders and abusers, what was happening with the staff at all levels, opened it out completely. It was tough because we had a short period, and these are things that normally takes time to absorb. But in that case, they did move on what we proposed.
Mm. Both that and the other example you talk about in more detail are quite extreme, aren't they? Because the other one was following a riot in a prison that had been very, very serious. It's interesting that these situations are quite extreme. Of course, you don't have to use dialogue as research and methodology in extreme situations. It's also just as impactful in more everyday situations, presumably. How do you think you and I end up in those more extreme situations doing this work?
I believe if you can successfully introduce dialogue into a correctional system and establish a healing environment that statistically reduces recidivism to the best in the country, then you can probably do it anywhere. So when in the UK, when invited into a prison, why not go along to a therapeutic community prison? Because that won't show very much. Let's go to a prison where it will show something. Yeah. So I admit on my side, I've chosen to try to go for tough issues, but done a lot of work in a lot of organizations which would not be at survival level, but they certainly had very tough challenges. I think of one, for example, a merger between two companies on a multi-billion-dollar project with very different cultures failing because they couldn't work together on it and establishing a common culture. Now, that was nothing to do with extreme situations around socially or violence, extreme financially perhaps, and worked in many very ordinary situations in small organizations. Third world work in India with people who are illiterate and so on. Yeah. Groups of philosophers where the big thing is the senior philosophers against the junior philosophers and why they can't talk to each other. This is universally applicable. Yeah. And I think as a pioneer, it's important to stake out some extreme situations, but that's not put off our listeners.
They can work with this wherever they are.
It would work fine in your primary school. It would work fine in your own business, whatever it might be.
Good. In that case, we're going to hear, I think, now from June, who has not worked in a prison, but she's worked in quite a few large corporate organisations.
So, Peter, identifying power and authority within the systems architecture seems to be a key step in setting up the conditions for successful dialogue. Can you expand on why that is the case?
Well,
good question.
Thank you for the question, June. I appreciate it because June has had senior roles in a number of large organizations and knows what she's talking about and understands the challenges involved at scale. The beginning for me is quite modest in this situation is often if you try to convene a group to start to understand what's happening in an organization in order to be helpful, people provide you with very helpful people. They provide you with the people who, of course, would be very supportive of what you're trying to do. And it's not that they're being unhelpful. By and large, they want you to succeed, so they give you helpful people. It's very unhelpful because you don't hear the real issues. So what I want in a group to start to find out are the people who are unhappy as well as the people who are happy. The people who've got an axe to grind need to be incorporated as well. Now, if you only start off with a partial group, it will eventually fade out because somebody in authority is not interested in it. You discover quite quickly that organizations are based on power meaning authority to do stuff and accountability for it. So I've watched endless people try to do good work where somebody above has eventually pulled the strings on the money or the time to do the work. So the sensible thing you start to realize is what is the power structure here? Now, part of it is formal power structure. Who's got the authority to decide this? What can the person I'm talking with do or not do? What have you got freedom to do? What can't you do? What do you have to go above and below for? So partly it's a formal structure. There's an informal structure as well. There are people who have to be satisfied to work. There's the characters who are going to cause so much trouble they can prevent stuff happening that you have to incorporate as well. So there's a range of ways in which power is used. Now, in the end, that power needs to be used to the benefit of everyone. So the power has to be incorporated. So you're going to, at some point, have to incorporate those power structures. So it's very wise at the beginning to see what they are, to understand how to do that. And, of course, they're changing. The real question is, how long will this man or woman be in the power situation they're in? If this piece of work is going to take 10 years, we might be better to start a level down. Because in time they'll move. The more junior people have time to learn a bit to be able to move into power. And we see that in organizations now where more junior people now have the authority to do what they might need to do. But I agree with June, with what I think is behind June's question, is I would want to read the power structure to make a decision about what kind of architecture is appropriate here. Can you start at the bottom and work up with a large change? If you have time. It takes time for that group to have the power and authority to do something. Can you work from the top down faster? In the end, you have to have both. So I'm hoping, June, that at least starts to address your question, but I'd enjoy a further conversation about it.
And wherever you start, knowing the structure and therefore what you need to incorporate is important.
Yes.
Peter, thank you. There was a lot to cram in there, but I think we have a good overview and there's much more in the book, as we know.
There is much more in the book, but it's been good to skim the tops of some of them.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast, with me, Jane Boyle, and Peter Garrett. If you're inspired by any of our thoughts today, visit dialogue-associates.com to find out more. We can only scratch the surface of what's inside the book with the time we have. So if you want to dig deeper into these stories and learnings, you can buy A New Kind of Dialogue at Waterstones, Amazon's, and all the usual bookstores. Leave a review and give the show a 5-star rating if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Join us next time as we discuss the next 3 chapters, starting with an integrated dialogue model, where Peter enfolds the various experiences we've spoken about across the series into a coherent way of thinking about dialogue and its practice and theory.